Nobody in Calhoun County paid much attention to the Merritt Farms back 40. Not anymore. The field had sat idle for 11 years, ever since a wet spring swallowed 2 rows of planting equipment and sent Harlan Merritt to the hospital with a back that never fully healed. The soil had crusted over in the years since, pale and cracked in August, a gray-brown hardpan stitched together by weeds that even the deer didn't bother with. Since then, the neighbors drove past it, the way people drive past an old argument, quickly and without looking too long. But in the late summer of Eli Merritt's 13th year, something changed. It started the morning Eli walked the fence line with his great-grandfather's old soil probe and stopped cold at the northeast corner of the dead field. He crouched down. He pressed his palm flat against the earth. He stayed there for almost 5 minutes, perfectly still, while the grasshoppers jumped around him and the morning light moved across the hardpan in long, flat stripes. Then he stood up, walked back to the barn, and returned with a spade. Nobody could understand what he thought he was doing. And what made it stranger was that he wouldn't say, "If you've ever trusted your instincts when everyone around you was certain you were wrong, you're in the right place." Subscribe for more unforgettable farm stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's uncover what the boy saw that everyone else overlooked. The first farmers to notice were Chet Dolan and his brother Rudy, who ran the operation next door and had been running it since before Eli was born. Chet leaned against his truck that morning, watching the boy push a shovel into clay-packed ground that hadn't been broken in over a decade. He crossed his arms. He shook his head. Then he laughed, not cruelly, but the way a man laughs when he's certain he's watching a waste of effort. Rudy didn't even bother getting out of the truck. "Son," Chet called out, "that ground's been dead since it flooded. You're not going to find anything worth finding." Eli looked up, nodded respectfully, and kept digging. That was the part nobody could explain. He never argued. He never gave a reason. He just kept going back every morning before school, every afternoon after chores, every Saturday with a determination that seemed almost out of proportion to what anyone watching could see. His mother Vera brought him water and asked quiet questions. He answered politely but vaguely. His father, who had inherited the farm the year prior and hadn't yet decided what to do with it, watched from the porch with the cautious hope of a man afraid to want something. By the second week, 5 neighbors had stopped laughing and started watching instead. The thing that confused everyone most was where Eli was digging. He wasn't following a grid. He wasn't moving in straight lines. He was tracing something, arcing south, then curving back northeast, like he was following an invisible path beneath the surface. Old Dale Fesser, who had farmed this county for 50 years and whose opinion meant something, stood at the fence one afternoon and studied the boy's pattern. "That child is reading the land," Dale said to no one in particular, "but reading it wrong." What Dale didn't know, what none of them knew, was what Eli had noticed the morning he first stopped at that fence line. He had been studying his great-grandfather's farm journals, old leather-covered notebooks he'd found in a trunk in the attic. In the 1940s, Theodore Merritt had written in careful pencil about the northeast corner of the back 40 as a place that never needed much water and never let the crops drown. He'd noted that earthworms concentrated there after heavy rains. He'd written about how the soil in that corner smelled different after a storm. Sweeter, darker, richer. Eli had tested the soil himself. He'd sent a sample to the extension office with his science teacher's help. The results came back showing the northeast corner had significantly higher organic matter than any other part of the field. The microbial activity in that small patch of ground was more than double what you'd expect from land that hadn't been farmed in over a decade. But the field's surface drainage ran the wrong way. Water pooled in the middle and never reached the corner, which meant the corner was getting moisture from somewhere else entirely. That was the question Eli couldn't let go. Where was the water coming from? And why had his great-grandfather written about that corner with such care, as if it were the most important piece of ground on the whole farm? The day he found the first stone was a Thursday in early September. He'd gone down about 18 inches in a section that felt noticeably cooler against the spade, and his blade struck something that rang with a dull, hollow echo. Not the flat thud of bedrock or the soft resistance of a buried root. He cleared the dirt carefully with his hands, working around the edges, and exposed the corner of a shaped stone. Flat, square-cut, fitted, not natural. He went and got his father. Together they widened the hole. Within an hour they had uncovered the edge of a stone-lined channel, running at a slight angle toward the southeast. The mortar between the stones was old, crumbling in places but deliberately placed. Someone had built this with intention, with knowledge, with patience. Vera called Dale Fesser that evening. He arrived the next morning with Chet Dolan and a retired land surveyor named Amos Webb, who had spent 40 years mapping the county and knew its water history better than anyone alive. Amos crouched over the exposed channel for a long time without speaking. He ran his finger along the cut edge of a stone. He looked at the angle of the channel. He stood and looked out across the field, tracing invisible lines with his eyes. Then he said, "I know exactly what this is." He explained it slowly to the growing circle of neighbors who had come to look. Before mechanical drainage systems, before clay tile lines and diesel-powered pumps, farmers in this region had sometimes built hand-cut stone channels to redirect subsurface water. These weren't wells, they weren't cisterns. They were passive drainage and irrigation systems, engineered to capture the natural seep of a spring or underground aquifer and direct it to where crops needed it most. They required extraordinary knowledge to build, a deep understanding of hydrology, soil pressure, seasonal water tables, and a slope so subtle the eye couldn't detect it standing in the field. You couldn't hire someone to find that for you. You had to watch your land across seasons, across years, until you understood its water the way you understood your own breathing. Theodore Merritt had not just farmed this land, he had listened to it long enough to engineer it. Over the following 3 weeks, Eli, now with the help of his father, Dale Fesser, and eventually a small archaeology team from the State Agricultural College, traced the stone channel across nearly 60 feet of the field. It was connected to a secondary channel that ran beneath what had been a drainage ditch, capped with flat stones and buried under decades of fill. Together the two channels formed a Y-shaped system that, if cleared and repaired, would draw water from a natural spring seep on the property's upper hillside and distribute it slowly through the northeast corner of the field, naturally, passively, without a pump or a pipe. The spring had never dried up. It had simply been disconnected. Chet Dolan stood beside Eli on the afternoon they flushed the first channel. It took 3 men to push water through the upper section and break the decades of silt loose. Then, slowly, something happened that none of them had expected to feel so strongly. Clear, cold water began to rise through the stone-lined path, seeping up through the soil at the low end of the channel, darkening the earth in a spreading crescent, climbing toward the surface. It didn't rush. It simply returned, quietly, steadily, as if it had only been waiting for someone to reconnect the path it had always known. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Chet said, barely above a whisper, "Your great-granddad knew something the rest of us forgot." Eli's father made a decision that winter. He would not sell the back 40, he would farm it. By the following spring, the northeast corner of the back 40 had been planted with a cover crop mixture, crimson clover and winter rye, to begin rebuilding the soil biology the restored moisture would now support. The earthworms came back first, drawn by the moisture and the loosened earth. then the ground beetles, then the microbes, then the quiet chemistry of decomposition that transforms dead ground back into living soil. Dale Fesser walked the field in April and pointed out to Eli how the root systems of the cover crops were already beginning to break apart the compacted clay, creating channels of their own, microscopic pathways carrying water, air, and nutrients deeper into the profile over time. The cover crops would die back and feed the soil they grew in. Then a cash crop could follow, planted into ground that had spent a full season being healed. Nature building on what the old stonework had started, one slow layer at a time. Neighbors who had once laughed at a boy with a spade now stopped to ask his opinion about soil drainage. The county extension office invited him to speak at their spring meeting. He stood at the front of the room, 13 years old and still uncomfortable with attention, and said only that he had read his great-grandfather's journals and trusted what they described. The stone channels were not the treasure. The observation was. The Japanese farmer and philosopher Masanobu Fukuoka once wrote that the ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Eli Merritt didn't discover anything that hadn't already been there. He simply paid attention long enough, quietly enough, and patiently enough to let the land tell him what it remembered. In doing so, he reconnected his family to something that had nearly been lost. Not just a buried channel, but a way of listening to the ground beneath your feet and trusting what you hear. The farmers who had laughed learned that too. Not all lessons come from experience. Sometimes they come from a 13-year-old boy who crouches in a field, presses his palm to the earth, and refuses to walk away. Have you ever trusted a quiet instinct when everyone around you was certain you were wrong? Think about that moment and share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Subscribe for more unforgettable farm stories, new episodes every week.